I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt to introduce an address by the head of state.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. يشرف.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Abdullah Shahid, President of to the 76th session of the General Assembly.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد عبد الله شاهد رئيس الدورة السادسة.
Mr. Abdullah Shahed, Excellency, President of the 76th session of the General Assembly. I would like to first and foremost congratulate you and your country on assuming the presidency of the current session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I wish you every success in your endeavors. I also commend the central role of the Secretary General of the United Nations through his tireless efforts to uphold the principles of the Charter. The Charter has been a rulebook and a reference in international relations for more than 75 years, and it remains a hope in establishing a rule-based international order and a peaceful world. Ladies and gentlemen, the onset of the global pandemic almost 2 years ago has shown that there are common traits for humanity, but there are other aspects that can be shared, such as challenges, no matter our level of development. Here, it is appropriate to point out the relevance of this year's theme, reflecting the need to build our resilience to COVID-19 and our hope in recovery. That is why we must remove all obstacles preventing countries from accessing vaccines in a fair and equitable manner as a top priority. In that context, allow me to take this opportunity from this high tribune to present Egypt's view of today's world and our contribution to overcoming global challenges as a founding member of the United Nations and a number of regional organizations, so that we can look at the challenges of today's world. Mr. President, the Egyptian state is aware of and recognizes the gaps in economic recovery of states, depending on their ability to obtain sufficient quantities of vaccines. Indeed, developed countries continue to receive the majority of vaccines produced globally. Egypt underscores the need for a swift and effective response to meet the needs of the African continent. Indeed, our continent is that which is most impacted by the pandemic, while it is also continuing to face other equally daunting challenges, some that are equally dangerous. For that reason, Egypt has sought to produce vaccines domestically, not only to meet the needs of our people, but also to export them to the African continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the prevailing circumstances have further exacerbated difficulties that we've experienced for decades, further weakening regional and international cooperation. And this is why it is necessary for the international community to provide support to the developing world and to include middle-income countries. These countries carry a significant democratic weight, as they are home to a large part of the world's population, making them major international consumers of goods and services and a driving force for world economic growth. In light of the recent international efforts to issue some $650 billion in special drawing rights at the IMF, we believe it is imperative to explore the best means to invest these resources for the benefit of the developing world, and in that context, reduce the debt of developing countries, especially African countries and middle and low income countries, and provide preferential rates by providing the necessary means for concessional funding and encouraging direct investments to these countries. These measures would provide crucial support for national development efforts in line with relevant international and regional development agendas. Mr. President, we are convinced that development must include a comprehensive framework inclusive of the necessary rights for the development of individuals and the promotion of a life of dignity for societies. Accordingly, Egypt has adopted a series of economic reform policies, allowing us to implement ambitious social programs for the benefit of the most vulnerable groups. And we have achieved the SDGs in a number of areas across Egypt. Egypt has also managed to reduce disparities between rural and urban areas, as we are convinced that the provision of basic services in all parts of the country will promote political and social inclusion by creating suitable conditions for the freedom of thought and innovation to allow innovation to flourish, creating more impetus for progress. Mr. President, Egypt is well aware of the threats that environmental degradation pose to all aspects of our life and that of future generations, if not their survival, especially as a result of climate change. Its adverse effects have become evident to all, as demonstrated by the many severe climate events across the world in recent months. From floods to heavy rainfall to unprecedented spikes in temperature and wildfires. These events have had human, economic, and social implications, which then add to the heavy burden of states and governments, struggling to guarantee the prosperity and well-being of their people. Given our common moral responsibility towards future generation and in line with our national vision and international commitments, Egypt spares no effort for greater coordination on climate issues. This is important if we are to avoid the point of no return, a point at which climate change would have become so entrenched it would be impossible to roll back. As an active participant in the climate change negotiations, Egypt looks forward to hosting the 27th Conference of State Parties in 2022. Mr. President, terrorism remains one of the largest challenges facing humanity today. In addition to violating people's most fundamental rights, especially the right to life, this phenomenon also distracts governments from fulfilling their socioeconomic and cultural duties towards their people. Egypt thus emphasizes that terrorism can only be eliminated by countering the takfiri and extremist ideologies that lead to such a heinous phenomenon. We need a comprehensive approach that would go beyond security and military confrontation of terrorists and terrorist groups, but that would also include social, economic, development, and ideological factors as well. We must focus on the sources of terrorism and tackle those factors that push individuals towards this phenomenon. And this approach should be rooted both in national actions and international cooperation. In this regard, all countries must uphold their obligations under international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, corrects the interpreter. I stress the need to hold accountable those countries that sponsor and harbor terrorists, including foreign terrorist fighters, by offering them shelter and support and facilitating their transit through territories, which threatens international peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt is committed to promoting the human rights of its citizens We make every effort to this end in full respect of the principles of citizenship and the rule of law. The Egyptian state is fully cognizant of the fact that Egyptians must be at the center of our comprehensive development efforts, the aim of which is to guarantee the dignity, rights, and freedoms of Egyptian citizens. The situation of human rights in Egypt has recently seen marked developments, reflecting the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the provisions of our Constitution and its amendments, and the relevant updated laws and legislation. The National Human Rights Strategy that Egypt launched a few days ago, following society-wide and civil society consultations, showcases Egypt's inclusive and constructive approach to all issues related to human rights. Mr. President, Egypt's election to the chairmanship of the current 15th session of the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission is the culmination of Egypt's continued and active contribution to promoting the United Nations peacebuilding architecture since its inception in 2005.
على قيادة الجهود
This demonstrates the confidence that the international community has in Egypt to lead international efforts in this regard. We are the seventh largest contributor of male and female troops and police to UN peacekeeping operations. Mr. President, Egypt has always reiterated that there can be no stability in the Middle East without a just, lasting and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question, which remains the central cause for the Arab region. This must happen in accordance with international resolutions to establish a Palestinian state along the June 4, 1967 border with East Jerusalem as its capital. In this regard, Egypt stresses the need to consolidate the ceasefire agreement reached on the 20th of May 2021. Egypt also calls upon the international community to take the necessary measures to improve the living conditions of the Palestinian people and to ensure humanitarian deliveries to the Palestinian peoples. Donors must be called upon to support UNRWA. This would pave the way for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. Egypt has also announced a pledge of $500 million for reconstruction efforts. The Middle East has a strategic location, but it is also in one of the most unstable regions in the world. This compounds global and shared challenges. This means that there are specific challenges faced by countries in the region. The concept of the strong and cohesive nation-state is under threat from factors including division and fragmentation, be it sectarian, political, or ethnic division. This has meant that countries rich in natural resources, history, and civilization, such as Iraq, a brother country, or rich in culture and diversity like Lebanon and Syria, or with resources and wealth such as Libya, or with strategically important locations such as Yemen, suffer numerous challenges. This proves that there is no alternative to the concept of the inclusive nation-state. States that do not distinguish between its citizens and prevent any interference in the affairs of the Arab region. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Egypt is closely linked to its African context, something that we are immensely proud of. This is geographical continuity, but also existential continuity. Hence the importance of cooperation of countries on this continent. But this must be a two-way street. It cannot be unilateral, being determined by one party to the detriment of others. Egypt recognizes its neighbors' right to development, but we are a country that suffers from droughts and people live under the water poverty line. The Nile is Egypt's lifeline, which explains the extreme anguish that Egypts feel over the Renaissance Dam. You are probably all aware of the current state of the negotiations between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, which have lasted for 10 years. We have come up against intransigence and an unjustified refusal to engage positively in negotiations. In consecutive steps, this is a unilateral approach and a policy of impositions which could further destabilize the region. Egypt thus sought the help of the United Nations Security Council to send UN observers and bolster African mediation efforts. Egypt remains committed to reaching, as soon as possible, a comprehensive, balanced and legally binding agreement on the filling and operation of the Ethiopian dam. This aims at ensuring the survival of 150 million people in Egypt and Sudan and to avoid causing irreparable damage to the peoples of both countries. This is based not only on the values of equity and logic, but also on robust international legal grounds, which call for the fair and just use of joint water resources in international rivers. Ladies and gentlemen, multilateralism is key. We are facing a great many challenges and difficulties. However, multilateralism remains our only refuge from escalating conflicts and disputes. Given the multiplicity of challenges facing us today, we must reflect on the best way to mobilize the resources needed to overcome these challenges, and this is a priority for the benefit of all of humanity. This is Egypt's clarion call to all of humanity. Let us stand together to save ourselves before it is too late. Let us arm ourselves not with the logic of force, but the force of logic. Thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you all a successful session.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Arab Republic of Egypt for the statement just made. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Pedro Castillo Terron,